It's Wednesday, September 12th, and I'm your host, Paula Hersey. Governor Charlie Baker has proclaimed September 2018 to be Emergency Preparedness Month to highlight the importance of emergency preparedness and to encourage planning for disasters and other types of emergencies. The Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, MEMA, the Department of Public Health, DPH, will promote public preparedness throughout the month through various outreach initiatives. These efforts are part of a month-long nationwide preparedness campaign to encourage residents to take simple steps to better prepare themselves, their homes, their businesses, and their communities. On today's show, Channel 18 will help individuals and families prepare during Emergency Preparedness Month by 1. Be informed and receive emergency alerts, 2. Plan for emergencies and disasters, build an emergency kit, and 4. Get involved in community preparedness and resiliency. Earlier this summer, the town of Barnstable formed its Emergency Operation Committee and met for an initial tabletop exercise to gauge the town's readiness for a disaster. Rob Steen, Assistant Director of Public Works, who designed and ran the morning session, joins us in studio to talk about how the town prepares for an emergency and how residents can too. It's an Emergency Preparedness Week in Massachusetts, and with me today, Assistant Director of Department of Public Works, Rob Steen. We're going to talk about how to prepare for an emergency. Rob, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start a little bit with how a town's going to prepare. Recently, the town went through an exercise that you coordinated called a tabletop exercise to prepare for a hurricane or some other type of emergency. Tell us what that was all about.
So stepping back a little bit, so we started this with DPW probably 3 years ago, where we recognized that we're pretty good at snowstorms. But the reason we're pretty good at snowstorms is because we've done a lot of them. And that since Bob, we really haven't had to deal with the hurricane, and we needed to practice those skills and sort of work those skill sets. So DPW started these exercises called HEREXs about 3 years ago. We started working through, but as we started getting better at them within DPW, we realized the reality of the situation is it's going to be bigger than DPW. We can certainly do the tactical issues on the ground, but there's a lot more people that need to be involved. So last year we brought the town manager into that discussion and some other town departments. And then this year the town manager wanted us to bring in the police, the fire, and the remainder of what's considered the EOC, or the Emergency Operating Committee, so that they'd come together and sort of form for the first time and say, this is how we'll move forward. So what we did is said, okay, let's form the EOC, let's do an exercise that will then test some least basic skills with them and start the training and learning process with them. So that's what that was.
So with that training process, that's actually going to just now be ongoing, correct?
Yes, we will do that at a minimum annually, such as we do that annually for DPW. So even though we did the HEREX for the town, DPW is going to do theirs again in October. And so this year we'll look at a different aspect of the storm than we did last year. So we'll do post-storm this year, for instance. I would expect with the EOC, initially we will probably do it more frequently because we're just starting to get the EOC up and running and starting to figure out what we are and what we're doing and how we do it together. But once they sort of hit a stride, then we'll probably go to an annual thing. But again, that's dictated by the town manager and the chief, who decide this is how much we need to practice these skill sets. This is the muscle memory we need to create here.
Okay. And when we talk about tabletop exercises, tell the residents at home what that is and what your experience is in conducting these.
So my experience is I've been in the United States Navy or in the United States military for 29 plus years now. And I've done a lot of exercises, whether they be centered on storms or whether they be centered on more traditional threat matrices with emergency operations centers and how those operate. So I have a lot of experience in that area. I'm currently the executive officer for Commander Naval Installations Command headquarter unit down in DC, which is in charge of all Navy installations up and down the East Coast. And so for instance, with Florence coming up the coast right now, we are stood up operating and have a bunch of guys down there right now operating as the watch center for them to get ready for the hurricane and then post-hurricane stuff. So I've got quite a bit of experience in those areas, which is why I sort of stepped into this and said, look, I'm happy to build the scenario, happy to sort of conduct this scenario for you, but at the end of the day, it's the participants and what they bring to the table that make it valuable or not.
Right. And who, so all five departments for fire were involved in this as well, our harbor masters, natural resource officers. What did they take away from this exercise?
So there's also finance, legal. It's all the people
Right.
that you don't necessarily think of being involved, but that sort of need to be involved because things happen with all them. Based on their comments, and all I can do is reflect what their comments were, I think a lot of it was, as much as anything, the realization of, wow, we don't know how to do this yet. We're going to get better at it, and we're now approaching it more and more. But that initially, at any rate, this was sort of a first and sort of an eye-opening experience to make them realize we probably should have some contracts in place. We probably should have some plans in place. We probably need to rewrite our emergency operation plan. Fire departments need to decide how we're going to do that, because having 5 fire chiefs could be difficult. So somebody needs to figure out how they're going to speak for themselves, how we are going to set the table up, who's going to be represented at the table, and then how we're going to go through issues such as evacuations and such. I mean, right now with Florence coming, you can see that South Carolina, North Carolina areas are doing mandatory evacuations. Were a Cat 2 to come to us, there are areas that we might want to think about that. We probably don't have the authorities to do a mandatory evacuation, but certainly a recommended one. We've never gone through any of those steps before. And so understanding, or at least not during my time here, so we need to understand how to do that and start to think all that through, so that when we get to that point, we have got some experience under our belt and we kind of know what we're doing.
All right. So let's really talk about residents getting prepared here, because it ultimately is up to them, a resident, to make sure that they have a kit ready, that they know their flood zones. So let's start with flood zones. The actual departments, the fire departments and the town have areas of GIS maps that tell you where your flood zone, and I believe MEMA does as well.
So there's a couple different products out there. So there's the FEMA firm maps, which talks to flood zones, which you get as part of, like, for instance, insurance. And those will speak to the AE zone, which is a 100-year flood, and the velocity zone, which is effectively the 100-year flood, but where there's enough wave action to cause destruction. And those can be found in a number of different places online. And they'll sort of tell you if you're susceptible to flooding in general. We're also developing products, and MEMA also now has products of inundation mapping. So to say that if you had, for instance, a 3-foot storm surge, now whether that comes from a hurricane or whether that comes from a nor'easter like we had last March, or whether that comes from just a bad snowstorm like we had Juno, what would 3 feet of storm surge on top of a high tide do? And we have mapping that shows what that will do and where that water will go and how much water is predicted to be standing there when that happens. It's a prediction. It's by no means a guarantee, but it's certainly informative, and it's something that as decision makers we need to understand, because we need to understand where we'll be able to get to and where we're not going to be able to get to. And we need to make sure that people that live in those areas may feel like, hey, my neighborhood's not flooding, but there's really one road out from my neighborhood and it does flood. So even though my house may not flood itself, I may not want to be here during the height of the storm because no one will be able to get to me or get from me. And then on top of that, that's just the flooding piece. If we're talking hurricanes, as we saw last year with Irma, there's that whole wind piece. And to say, at what speeds will the town go out, and is it safe for town employees to go out and deal with issues, and at what speeds is it just not safe for anyone to be moving around, and wherever you are is where you are, and you need to kind of be able to hang out there. So understanding mapping and understanding the flooding, understanding what may or may not happen, and then watching the forecasting and understanding what those winds would do in combination to that is something I think everybody should start to become more aware of. Final point. And this again ties back to Florence as we're looking at it come up the coast, or Harvey last year, or I was just down in DC with CNIC and we were tracking Lane as it came into the Hawaiian Islands, and particularly the Big Island in Hawaii. Harvey stalled out over Houston and dropped 60 inches of rain. Lane dropped, and last I saw was about almost 40 inches of rain on the Big Islands. They're predicting a Florence dropping a significant amount of rain, in particular if it stalls, in the Carolinas. That in itself can be extremely destructive. Wind aside, tidal flooding aside, or storm surge aside, just that amount of fresh water coming down at one point in time can be destructive. We've had storms of 4 and 5 inches, and for instance, the intersection of Old Stage and Route 28 flooded out. And we know that there's roads that if you get that much water coming at it, those storm drain systems are built for 25-year storms, and they're no longer effectively 25-year storms in many ways. They're not going to be able to handle that. They will get overwhelmed, and then the roads will start to flood out. And people need to kind of understand all of that together to understand what effectively the risk is to them. And if they're going to stay in place, what they need to have with them to be able to do that, and whether staying in place is actually a good idea or not, or if they should really think about moving.
Right. So let's talk about some of those other factors. Obviously, the storms themselves, as they come through, there's a certain period of time that emergency services and DPW services stop.
So what we've talked about different wind speeds on that. Recently, it's been sort of between 60 and 80 miles per hour in terms of wind speed. I think it probably will land somewhere in there is what that ends up being. But at that point in time, it is really not safe for our people to be out trying to do anything. And they probably should stop. Right. Certainly if there's, and I don't even want to qualify it, just at that point we really shouldn't be out. Now whether that be DPW, fire, police, whomever, it just gets to the point where it's just too dangerous, there's too much stuff flying around in the air, there's too many things coming crashing down for people not to be sheltered at that moment. And people need to understand that. We've not seen a storm like that. Well, I was here for Bob, and I think the top winds in that were 70s miles per hour, and that was a long time ago. So we've really, I mean, Juneau we had hurricane force winds, but I think they reached up to about 70. But we've really not seen winds like that here. But if we get one, and everyone's predicting that now bigger, stronger storms will survive and come up the coast as sea surface temperatures rise, there will probably be a time during the storm, like I promise you'll see in Florence, like they probably saw in Irma, where emergency service workers are not going to be able to go out. And you are going to have to be where you are and weather whatever happens to you there. If your roof comes off, if you all of a sudden don't feel well, all those other issues, it's likely we will not be able to get to you at that point. And that needs to go into your calculus about where you want to be physically to ride the storm out.
Right, and let's talk about riding the storm out. So how do people prepare for that? It seems overwhelming, especially if you've got young children or perhaps elderly people in your home.
So I mean, I look at that in a couple different levels. So initially, let's do it sort of the short term and the long term ride out issue. So short term, which is the duration of the actual storm itself, when it's really sort of battering you. I think that's a discussion about, do you want to do that? Are you in a place that's susceptible to flooding, that's susceptible to lots of wind damage, that is susceptible to freshwater flooding from a lot of rainfall or has poor drainage? I think all those need to go into your thought process before you decide you're going to ride it out or not. I would never recommend, particularly if there is a advisory out or any sort of recommendation from the state for evacuation. Look, we all grew up in New England, and we're all hardy New Englanders, and we're all tough. No comment on that. If someone says you probably should evacuate your area, I would highly recommend you do that. I don't think it's wise to buck that trend. And there will be times, because it's forecasting, that people will evacuate and nothing will happen. And they will get frustrated because it's inconvenient and it's a pain. But if there's that one time that it saves your life, it's certainly worthwhile. Then if you decide, despite all that, and again, my recommendation is to not do that, despite all that, that you are going to ride out, you need to start thinking about sort of primary needs and what you have to have with you, and this will start to transition into the longer term. Assume you won't have power. Assume you won't have contact to the outside world, at least for a while. In contact, I mean physical contact, being able to get places. Likely you won't have communication abilities. Well, even last winter, the Samsung phones for the cell phones, those towers, AT&T towers went down. So those weren't available to people. So you need to make those assumptions. And so thus, if you have medications you need to have enough of it to make sure you can get through not only the storm itself, but for some extended period of time afterwards where you may be stuck there. Water, food. If it's a summertime, you're probably ice, you're going to lose refrigeration. How you're going to deal with those issues, perishables, how you're going to cook, how you're going to move all through all that stuff. It's a long list, and I'm by no means an expert to tell you what to have, and which is why I'd recommend really thinking hard about doing that. If you're going to really start thinking through, what are my primary needs? What are the people that are with me's primary needs? It's not just water for one. If there's 5 people in my house, do I have enough water for everybody for however many days I think I may be able to not get out or not have power? It may be that there's no power. I mean, last winter, that one storm, almost the entire Cape was out of power. Briefly, but out of power. I remember when I was here at Bob, we were out of power, I think it was for 5 days. Grocery stores don't operate when there's no power. Gas stations don't operate when there's no power. So you have to sort of think all that through ahead of time in somewhat of a survivalist mode if you're going to try this. But again, and you can't say it enough because I don't want anyone to come away from this conversation feeling like I'm at all advocating you should ride out. Right. If someone comes to you and says your area, your neighborhood, your section of town should evacuate, whether it's mandatory or not, I would seriously consider doing so.
Right. So we'll end this conversation. Folks can go to FEMA for a list of things that they should have in their emergency kits. Some of the considerations, obviously communication is one of those large ones, and money. ATMs don't work without electricity either, but also trying to communicate with the outside world. Cell phones go out, landlines are out, those types of things. So FEMA.gov has all of those kits and things that you can make for that. And any last words that you want to give residents to try to we want people to really understand that now's the time to prepare, not 2 or 3 days before a storm.
Yeah, I guess the point would be, look, it's been a long time since we've dealt with something like this. However, it's also been a long time since a Cat 4 has threatened the coast of the United States, and now it is. So things, for whatever reason, are changing in terms of the climate. And even though we've not had, and it's easy to get lulled into complacency, we've not had major storms or hurricane-level storms here. We have had other significant storms, which give us a taste of it. Let's not get complacent. Understand what those potentially could do, understand the ramifications of those, whether they be a hurricane or just a really bad nor'easter or something in between. And really think through, based on where you are, what your options are, so that when you get to the storm, you're not trying to make decisions from scratch. You've already kind of thought, and that's going back to the exercises that the town's doing. That's why the town does those. So that when you get into those situations, it's not, oh goodness, how do I deal with this? We've kind of thought through some of it. We probably don't have everything squared away, but we've got a lot of it at least been discussed to some level. So there's a place we could pick up and move from in terms of discussion. And it's not all new. If it's all new, it's going to be confusing and overwhelming and potentially be difficult for you to get through it safely.
Thanks so much, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Anytime. Always fun.
Thank you. Centerville, Osterville, Marston's Mills Fire Chief Michael Wynne has some tips to help keep you and your loved ones safe during a disaster. Do you have a plan?
The best advice we have is to be aware, and I know it sounds cliche in Awareness Week, but really pay attention to what's coming as far as weather reports, messages from your elected leaders, and public safety messages from the departments that respond. These folks take a great deal of time, energy, and hard work in making sure we get the best, most accurate, up-to-date information out to our residents and our guests. And it's important for you to pay attention to what those messages say or recommend. When we think about preparedness, the first thing I would recommend is if you live in our district, you should know your zone. And knowing your zone means where are you if there's a flood. Those maps are on our website, they're on the MEMA website. They're available for everyone to see and look at and really consider what would happen to where you live if we were to have a hurricane such as the one bearing down on the Carolinas and the Virginia coast. What would that mean? And it's easy to see online. Know your zone is a very important component. The next component I would think about is the ability to be self-sufficient. If we have a major weather emergency and you have to be self-reliant, that's going to require you to prepare for 3 to 4 days of fresh water, food, and have a contact off Cape that can check in on you in the case communication systems go down. So you have some way of communicating, if you can, with someone off Cape who could relay messages to us. If folks are asked to evacuate, it's not because we want to hinder you or burden you. It's because we may not be able to respond to your location should there be an emergency. Evacuation notices are taken very seriously. They can really only be offered by the governor. And if someone says it's time to evacuate, it's because it's time to evacuate. We take that very seriously. Be self-sufficient for 3 days. Have food, water. Make sure your pets are taken care of. Make sure you have meds ready to cover you if you have any prescription issues. And just be ready to be self-reliant. We may not be able to help. In the event of a Category 2 or 3 hurricane, the wind is going to limit our ability to respond because it simply won't be safe to put our responders on the road. We will take every response on a risk-based assessment, and there may be times where, due to weather, water, flood heights, street closings, we may not be able to get out and effect aid if requested. That's a two-way street. So if you hear of the wind and you hear of the water, that also means you shouldn't be out on the road, or you should be in a safe place as well. The biggest component is, honestly, is to be aware and to listen to the messages that are coming out from the agencies that are charged with protecting you. We offer a great deal of hurricane preparedness resources on our website, which would be www.comfiredistrict.com. In addition, you can go to the MEMA website, the Massachusetts Emergency Management website. They have a great deal of information specifically to Awareness Week, but also those Know Your Zone flood maps, tips for preparing self-sustainment for 3 days, and the things to consider for your family and your pets. So MEMA.gov has a lot. Remember that children are going to be listening to everything you're hearing on the TV. Even my 3-year-old son today at home was asking me about Hurricane Florence and if it was coming to Cape Cod. Children are very perceptive, and they know exactly what's going on because they hear the same messages that you hear. It's important to comfort your children and let them know that we'll take care of them the best we can, and have them be prepared for a bug out if necessary. The elderly are our greatest concern, whether it's a resident who lives at home who's on oxygen at home or requires a lot of prescription medications. Those folks need to be really looked at as a at-risk population for us as a community. We have shelters available here in the town of Barnstable and on Cape Cod, but really the elderly need to have the ability to have someone help them to be sustainable if something goes bad with a storm. We ask neighbors to check on their elderly neighbors. We ask family to check on their elderly family members. And just remember, there may be times we just simply cannot get to you because of the conditions of the storm.
Here's a look at our community calendar. Big things are happening at the Barnstable Senior Center. As they approach their 20th anniversary and launch evening programs, they need you to help them create their vision and engage in a conversation regarding the future. Join them to provide your feedback, ideas, and suggestions. There will be 2 listening sessions this week at the Barnstable Senior Center for Community Conversations. Thursday, September 13th at 6 p.m. and Friday, September 14th at 10 a.m. Come, be a part of the conversation and shape your community at the Barnstable Senior Center, located Route 28, Hyannis. Here's a look at this week's meeting schedule for boards, commissions, and committees. Comments, suggestions, accolades? Connect with us on Facebook and Instagram. Email us or send us an old-fashioned note by carrier pigeon. Channel 18 works for you. I'm Paula Hersey, and thank you for watching Barnstable Today.